thank you all for getting up on a Saturday morning to be here in the rain. I'm really excited to be here this morning and to be taking part in this kind of gathering where we come together to talk about what kind of society we're going to build in the ashes of this one. I think this is a conversation that we need to be having all the time. This is the conversation of our time. And I'm excited to be a part of it here today. I'm excited that all of you want to come out on a Saturday morning to be a part of that conversation. For my part, I want to address it from the perspective of the climate movement and the social movement that we need to create this transformation. Part of that is because my experience is with social movements, and that's what I feel like I have the authority to speak on. But it's also because I really feel like that's where our power is. Social movements are how people without positions of authority, people that are outside of our normal power structure, influence change, how we make our voices heard. And so that's really, I think, what's going to be the most important part of guiding this transformation that we need to a more healthy and just society is social movements. So it's important to think about what that social movement should look like. And of course, the first step of that is looking at what is necessary, because our social movement has to be appropriate to the challenge that lies ahead of us. And for too long, I think we've just kind of coasted on with an environmental movement that came out of a very different set of challenges and a very different set of circumstances from the 1960s and 1970s. And so looking at this challenge now, we have to look at how that might be different. And I think right now it's an exciting time to do that, because the climate movement has been in a big period of transition over the past 5 years or so. I think when we write the history of the climate movement, I think that 2009 will be the turning point for a lot of reasons. And one of those reasons is the failure of the big green strategy and the Washington-centric side of the climate movement. But perhaps what will turn out to be the more important turning point that happened in 2009 was that going into 2009, for those of you who were active and engaged with the movement at that time, you probably got lots of messages and emails and heard lots of statements with the phrase "last chance" or "our last best chance," and it was the last best chance to stop climate change was the phrase that was used pretty often, or the last best chance to prevent catastrophe, and it was, and we failed. We failed with the phony climate bill that was in Washington. We failed in Copenhagen. And so that last best chance to maintain the status quo faded away. And now we know that we're going through this period of transition. And so all that really means is that the status quo is off the table. It means that things have to change in one way or another, that they will change. And they will likely change in fairly radical ways. And it means that the challenge for the climate movement is no longer just reducing emissions to stop climate change. But we've had this new challenge that's been emerging since 2009 of how do we maintain our humanity through this period of rapid and intense change that we are in store for. I think that is really the question that is now looming, and that's what we need a climate movement to do, is to maintain our humanity, to make sure that this period of transition becomes one where it brings us together rather than turning us against one another. That it's the kind of period of transition that gets us to reflect and reconnect with our values rather than abandoning our values in times of desperation. And part of what this new challenge means is that there's not really a point on the horizon where we can say things are going to be okay at this point. which is how at least the modern era of social movements is structured and organized, where we say there's this threat right now, and so we need you to step out of your normal lives for a minute, and sometimes it's literally just a minute that we want you to click something online, and then you go back to your normal lives, that we're meeting this one threat right now, and then we're going to go back to the kind of world where everybody can just sit back and soak up their comfort and convenience. Or it's something that has been sort of a long-term problem, and we say we're gonna solve this problem, and we're gonna get rid of this injustice, and then after that there's gonna be this promised land, this utopia after we win. And when we look at the threat ahead of us now, there's not really that point where we can say we're going to solve this problem by this point, and after that we win, and there'll be some kind of utopia out there, or at least not any kind of utopia in which we can sit back and enjoy that comfort and convenience and trust that there's some outside entity that's going to protect our rights for us. The closest that we'll get to that utopia on the other side is a sort of ongoing, constant revolution, where we're constantly we're going to need that constant movement. It's going to be a movement that's not just here for a little bit, or that's not just here to solve short-term problems. It's going to have to be a movement that keeps going, a movement without end, a movement that's here to stay. And I think that's a totally different kind of organizing than most of our climate movement right now is built around, with a lot of different kinds of challenges. And so some of the requirements, I think, of this endless movement is that it's going to have to obviously look beyond just our short-term goals. A lot of the climate movement and really the left in general over the past 30 years has said, we're going to do whatever it takes to win this one short-term little battle, whether it's a piece of legislation or it's some campaign. We're going to use whatever talking points it takes to win this little battle, or to get the votes in Congress that we need, even if they're right-wing talking points, even if they're talking points that promote a worldview that's antithetical to where we really want the world to be heading. And so we haven't had a comprehensive vision really coming out of the left. We haven't had a worldview that's articulated by the left. The only worldview that's really been in the public discourse in a big way over the past 30 years has been a pretty dystopic Ayn Randian sort of worldview that says we're just isolated individuals and we should only care about ourselves. Because conservatives since the 1970s have had that long-term game plan where they've said, we're going to articulate a worldview even if it's a losing battle right now, even if we sound absolutely ridiculous celebrating selfishness, we're going to do it because it shifts values over time. And they gradually become less and less ridiculous over time, or they sound less and less ridiculous because they keep repeating this worldview. And that's the kind of long-term thinking that we need, that goes beyond immediate pragmatism and articulates real values and principles. And the thing about that is that it's not just something that we're lacking in the climate movement right now, is these principles and values that guide our long-term thinking. It's something that's actively discouraged by the structural model of NGOs and nonprofit organizations and the foundations that fund them. It doesn't fit into a grant-making model that is built around deliverables and short-term measures of progress. The creation of values and the articulation of a worldview doesn't fit into that model. and so we're not seeing it very much. One of the other factors that's really important for an ongoing, endless movement is highly valuing relationships. That people are more than just a resource. People are more than just a list of numbers on a petition. People are more than just something that gives you leverage when you meet with a legislator. But that people have value in and of themselves in this movement. That's something that's going to be really vital for this long-term, endless movement. And again, that's something that we don't really see in most of the climate movement. Because it's based so much on expediency and this plan that's been worked out that we need to follow through on this plan that we put in our grant proposal last year in order to get the next funding cycle. We need to keep moving forward with this agenda. And any actual human needs, any actual people or relationships are kind of a drag on that because human beings don't necessarily fit into that agenda in a clear way. And we see that right now in the climate movement with the calls for civil disobedience that have gone out over the past few years. That's been one of the big transitions that we've had in the climate movement over the past few years, is a new embrace of civil disobedience as a tactic. At least to some extent, at least sort of the photo op style civil disobedience that we're seeing a lot of. And so we've gotten some groups that have embraced civil disobedience and have put out these calls to action. And people have been responding. People have been willing to take those risks. And it's turned out, that when you ask people to do more, people actually want to do more. So we've got people taking those kinds of actions. But the groups that have put out those calls are not necessarily there after the photo op is done, when the people are dealing with the consequences of those actions. The most recent case in point was up in Michigan with the Michigan Coalition Against Tar Sands, where last summer there was the Fearless Summer campaign, and then the Summer of Heat directly after that. A coalition of a bunch of groups pulled off those weeks of actions where they were putting out these calls asking people to engage in civil disobedience around the country. And so on the first day of Fearless Summer, there was a guy named Chris Wamhoff that used a skateboard to wheel himself into the Enbridge pipeline when it was under construction after it had leaked in his backyard in Kalamazoo. And he shut down that pipeline construction for the day. And then a month later, with the Summer of Heat campaign, there were 4 activists. They were friends of Chris. They were part of the Michigan Coalition Against Tar Sands. And they locked themselves down to the construction equipment at the Enbridge site. And so these were actions that were celebrated by the folks who would put out these calls to action. They put out emails afterwards celebrating these, saying, "Send us money and we'll keep doing this sort of thing. We'll keep making these calls to action." And then the case wasn't quite over for the people that actually engaged in those actions. Then they got charged with felonies. And Chris Wamhoff's case was dropped, but for the other 4 people, their case was not. And 3 of them said, well, the actual action was only one little piece of it. And civil disobedience doesn't end as soon as the handcuffs come out. There's a lot that happens after that. And the trial is a great organizing opportunity. It's an important part of the whole process of bringing our case before a jury of our peers. And so they kept pushing it all the way through. And the 3 women who did that 2 weeks ago yesterday, were convicted of a felony and a misdemeanor each, and were locked up immediately and have been held without bail and are facing sentencing in March and are looking at up to 3 years each. But the groups that put out these calls to actions weren't there. They weren't there when these folks were going through this process. They were largely left on their own. The Michigan Coalition Against Tar Sands is a very small local group without deep pockets. And even some of the groups that had specifically referenced their actions in fundraising emails, like 350.org, didn't really have people's backs. And that was heartbreaking for me to see because I really had the opposite experience. I jumped into civil disobedience without a really strong support network that was already established. That there wasn't a climate organization that asked me to engage in my action. I saw an opportunity and I jumped into it. And what I found was that there was a tremendous amount of people that then wanted to support that. And this amazing network and community of people came together really quickly afterwards and just became a phenomenal base of support for me. And for me, that was one of the most meaningful parts of the entire experience, was seeing that there are people out there that will really have our backs when we stick our neck out. And that came from Peaceful Uprising, the organization that I started, and it came from the Unitarian Church in Salt Lake City, and then later on the Unitarian churches around the country that were supporting me through that. And so it was disappointing for me to see that a lot of the climate movement, especially the mainstream climate movement, isn't there yet, isn't to the point of saying, even when it's an inconvenience, we're going to stick with people. We're going to hold on to people. We're going to be the kind of movement that holds people and doesn't let them go. That when people take a risk, we're going to hold on to them and hold them up and make the most out of their sacrifice. And we're going to hold on to them and support them. We're going to hold on to them and comfort them, whatever they need. We're going to be there for those people. We don't yet have that commitment in the climate movement. But if we're going to have this kind of ongoing movement that we need, a never-ending movement, it's going to have to be that kind of loving movement that really holds on to people and values people as people. And there's a way in which that's almost contrary to a lot of the expediency-driven thinking that dominates the climate movement. It's almost a little bit unreasonable. And I would argue that that's what a never-ending movement needs. It needs an unreasonable morality. A morality that says, even if we don't see the positive benefits that are going to come out of it for us, we're still going to uphold these values and these principles. That even if it doesn't make sense with our agenda right now, we're still going to uphold these values. We're still going to hold on to our principles, even when it's unreasonable. Because there will be a lot of those situations in our future, I think. When we look at the hardships that we're facing, there will be plenty of good reasons to compromise our values. There will be plenty of good reasons to sell out. And if we're going to resist that, if we're going to create the kind of world that's really in line with our values, we're going to have to hold on to those values even when it's unreasonable to do so. And one of those values that might seem a little counterintuitive or maybe too obvious to mention is truth. That we need a movement that actually values truth. And I know a lot of people are going to argue with me when I say that the climate movement right now does not value truth. That there is not nearly enough truth in the climate movement. And I see that in a couple of ways. One is the resistance to telling hard truths, to telling people how bad things actually are when it comes to climate change, to telling people that things are not going to be okay in a sense of the way that they are right now, that we are not going to avoid catastrophic impacts. We are not going to avoid drastic levels of hardship. And I know a lot of people in the climate movement and in climate science as well who have internalized that themselves. They've gone through this period that I've come to understand is sort of like a period of mourning. It's like a period of grieving for our own future and the future of everyone that we care about, of accepting how bad things might get. They've been through that themselves and found a way to recommit themselves to even more serious action. And yet they're not willing to express that to others. They're still not willing to express those hard truths to the audiences that they're speaking to. And a lot of folks that I know in the climate movement and climate scientists will privately tell me that they know that it's too late to avoid catastrophic climate change. They know that it's too late to avoid going past 4 degrees. And yet, they're still not willing to say that publicly. And I think that's the kind of truth that we need if we're going to have a real movement. We're going to have to trust that people can handle that truth and that we can help them handle that truth. And that might take a little bit different leadership in this movement. For a long time, we've put most of our leadership in the hands of scientists in this movement, and they've done a fantastic job in a lot of ways. But nobody got into atmospheric science because they wanted to help people through the grieving process. That's not where their area of expertise lies. That's where the area of expertise of communities is in facing up to the hard realities of life and getting through them together. And there's sort of an unspoken conventional wisdom in the climate movement at this point that in order to maintain the hope that is necessary for people to keep going and to keep fighting, in order to have hope, we need to be positive. We need to only look at the positive side of things. In order to have hope, we need to kind of avoid those really hard truths. And for me, that's what actually hurts my hope the most when I see people acting like we're not strong enough to handle those hard truths. That to me is one of the most despairing things that I see, is when people act like we're not strong enough as a movement, as a community, as a people to handle the hard truth of reality. And I think if we're going to have any lasting hope, any hope that's not going to fade away, that hope is going to have to be based on a faith that we are strong enough to face up to the truth of reality. Our hope is going to have to be built on a foundation that we are strong enough to sing sad songs, that we are strong enough to look at those hard truths and the hard emotions that come with them and get through that and find strength in that. And so I don't see a lot of the things that we need to build this kind of movement in the mainstream of our current climate movement, in that NGO model. And I see some structural factors in the way that the funding works for that, in the way that those institutional structures of 501c3s are built, that make me think that we're not going to get there with the climate movement. That the climate movement, the NGO climate movement, the mainstream climate movement, is not only not up to the challenge right now, but I don't think it's going to be. I don't think that the climate movement, as it's built right now, can be the vehicle for this kind of empowered long-term movement that we really need it to be. And of course, there are exceptions to that. There are parts of the larger climate movement that really are embracing this sort of principled, long-term, really values-based organizing that we need. A lot of them have recently gotten together in what's called the Climate Justice Alliance that is built up of groups like the Black Mesa Water Coalition and similar groups around the country. Their big gathering was last summer on the Dene Reservation in Black Mesa in Arizona. Their next gathering is in Richmond, California. And it's made up of some frontline groups, I think around 35 of them from around the country, in places like West Virginia and Appalachia, in places like Richmond, California, places like Black Mesa, places like Pine Ridge, South Dakota, with the Lakota Nation, and one of the things that all these organizations have in common is that they're all poor people. I mean, part of it is that they're all working for really fundamental economic change at the same time that they're working for fundamental energy change and things like that. But not only are they all at the bottom of the economic spectrum, they all are facing some sort of oppression, and a lot of historical oppression. Some of that is racial oppression in places like Oakland and Richmond. Some of it is oppression of our Native American tribes that's been going on as long as white people have been here, pretty much. And the sort of really principled organizing that we need is coming out of those communities. That's where we find movements with soul, because that's really, if we were going to wrap up the things that I'm talking about here, of a movement that values truth, a movement that values people, a movement that is based on principles and has an unreasonable morality, something that we can't quite explain why it makes sense to uphold these principles right now in this situation, but we're going to do it anyway. That's soul. And the places that we find movements with soul happen to be poor people. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think that it's something that comes out of hardship and out of suffering that gives people that longer-term perspective and that deeper grounding. That when people have faced that kind of hardship and dealt with that sort of suffering in their lives and have decided to fight back, this is the key thing. They've faced that hardship and decided to fight back. It gives them a deeper commitment than we see in what we could call the rich and comfortable side of the mainstream climate movement. And the thing about these folks are, they don't really have the funding that the rest of the movement has. And so that's why they tend to be very small groups, generally working on localized fights, is because they're not in that resource flow that flows through the mainstream of the climate movement, through foundations, through grant-making institutions. They're not a part of that. And yet they're the foundation of where we need to be building a movement. And I almost called my talk today, I almost titled it, "Why the Climate Movement Needs to End," but I was afraid that people wouldn't show up, or that they would show up really angry. But I do kind of think that that's really what I'm talking about here. I think that the mainstream climate movement needs to needs to collapse. It needs to end. And that the very comfortable organizers within that mainstream climate movement, working in those NGO jobs, they need to fail. I think they need to be brought down. I think they need to have a little bit of hardship and a bit of suffering, and they need to create space for those historically oppressed groups. And maybe I should have called it Why the Climate Movement Needs to Fail. Sorry. And when they do, they might get a little bit of soul. When they've poured their hearts out into something, and they've seen it collapse, and they've suffered a little bit, we might get a little bit of soul through that in whatever rises up to replace the climate movement. I think we've gotten to the point where those climate justice groups that are operating in poor frontline communities, I think they've built up enough of a presence and enough of a foundation and solid enough principles that they're prepared to be the foundation of what replaces the mainstream climate movement. We're ready for that. And the reality of a transformation, especially a transformation at this point in history where we've reached the peak capacity in so many ways, so much of our ecosystem is at peak capacity, is that a transformation means that some people are going to have to lose, and that the people living in comfort and convenience are going to have to sacrifice that comfort and convenience. And if we're serious about shifting power in real ways, and creating a significantly new society and a significantly new movement that takes seriously that historical oppression and lifts up those historically oppressed groups, it means that the mainstream of the climate movement, made up of rich white people, is going to have to lose something. We're going to actually have to sacrifice. We've been on a path for a long time of trying to transition and transform without anyone making any sacrifices. But that's one of those areas where we need a little more truth in this movement, is that that's not really possible. That we've reached a point where we can't grow our way out of this problem. And more of the climate movement have acknowledged that on an economic level. Most of the climate movement has stopped promoting the mythology that more economic growth is going to solve this problem. But we haven't really acknowledged it on sort of a personal level. We haven't acknowledged what that means for ourselves and our organizations and our movement. That if we're going to correct some of these inequalities, we can't grow our way out of correcting those inequalities, where we keep what we've got and other people just get more from somewhere. It means we're going to have to give something up. And I think we should be starting with the mainstream of the climate movement. And I know that's not necessarily a popular position, but I think it's time for that. The challenge has shifted significantly enough over the past 5 years and the past decade, that the institutions that we have built are simply no longer appropriate to the challenge. And rather than being committed to the continuance of an institution just for its own sake, which has never really been a good idea, I think it's time to let some of those go and create some new space. And embrace a little bit of insecurity. I think that's one of those coping skills that we're going to need moving into a radically different future, is being more comfortable with insecurity. We're going to have to be living in insecurity. And it starts with us. It starts with our own organizations. And I think a good first step is letting go of the security of some of our institutions, acknowledging that we as individuals are going to keep working towards our vision of a healthy and just world, but we're going to let go of the convenience of our institutions, and we're going to embrace a different way of organizing in this movement, and a different locus of leadership. It's a little bit scary, but when we look at our future, it's a little bit of scariness that'll help us prepare for what lies ahead. And I think it's something that we can handle, and I think it's not only something we can handle, it's something that it will make us stronger, that it will remind us that we are strong enough to deal with those hard realities, that we are strong enough to sing sad songs together, and that is where we can base our hope, that we no longer need to be basing our hope off of the denial of hard reality, but we can base our hope off of our own strength to stand in a position of insecurity and to stand together and to know that we will make it through it. Thank you.